For more, let's cross to New York City. Columbia University law professor Bernard Harcourt defends a death row inmates. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your reaction to Gavin Newsom's decision?
I think it's remarkable. I think it's also formative in terms of abolition in the United States. It's a difficult period for abolitionist movements in the United States, particularly because of Donald Trump and also because of the new Supreme Court. But I think what it reflects is a continuing movement aggregated across the country against the death penalty. And I think it was a remarkable act of conscience on the governor's part, more so than a reflection of the politics of California, because as you know, the recent referenda went in favor of the death penalty. So it's not as if he's reflecting the popular opinion so much as acting out of a real personal act of moral conscience, and a very politically brave and courageous act, I would say.
You're saying that public opinion could be changing. Donald Trump tweeting earlier saying friends and families of the always forgotten victims are not thrilled, and neither am I. Is public opinion on Donald Trump's side, though?
Well, public opinion is gradually disfavoring the death penalty. There were changes in terms of public opinion polling. Basically, the time when the United States disfavored the death penalty the most was actually in the 1960s. But then there was a gradual increase in support, of popular support, at least in the opinion polls. And today it's getting a lot narrower. So since for the past 10 years, there's been a constant decrease in support for the death penalty. And of course, when the option of life imprisonment without parole is offered to individuals in these polls, there's a majority of Americans who oppose the death penalty.
We know that there's been a blowback against the over-harsh sentencing of the past in the United States. But when a state like California decides on a moratorium for death row inmates, is it still a bit of an outlier, particularly in some of the places that you go with your death row inmate clients in the Deep South?
Right. Yeah. I mean, California has always been very different in terms of its relationship to the death penalty. It's had the largest death row in the country, astonishingly, but with very few executions. So you can hardly compare a state like California to a state like Texas, which also has an enormous death row, not as big as California, but enormous, and also executes all the time. Most of the executions in this country are from Texas. California has always had it's had a punitiveness to it, and the three strikes laws were in part born there, and the ramping up of mass incarceration happened in California, and they've been very punitive across a number of aspects of criminal justice, and they've also imposed a lot of death sentences, but it's always gone in somewhat in a different direction in California, in part because of the bar in California and the legislature that put in place a really robust defense, criminal defense, capital defense mechanism. And so the lawyers in California have, for the large part, stopped many of these executions from happening. And the situation is completely different than, for instance, in a state like Alabama, where I've practiced for 30 years, where there is no statewide defender, there is no capital defender for the state, there are no resources really provided by the state for representation of inmates on death row. So it is a bit sui generis. California tends to be that way, but I think that by taking off basically 723 persons from possible execution, you've really reduced the population of death row eligible for executions by a quarter, and it does send an enormous signal to the kind of continuing momentum at a grassroots level, a momentum against the death penalty.
Is it momentum? Is it momentum, Bernard Harcourt, or is it just a sign that the United States is ever increasingly polarized, and the progressive states are becoming more progressive, and the conservative ones more conservative?
Well, there's no doubt that there's polarization, and particularly polarization on these issues of the death penalty and criminal justice and mass incarceration. But across the United States, the number of persons who have been executed is at an all-time low. Last year, 25 persons were executed in the United States, which is historically really a low number for the United States. In the 90s and even at the beginning of the aughts, the numbers were in excess of 100, and it's been a steep decline to numbers that are really relatively inconsequential, of course not for the persons who are executed, but for an enormous country of the size of the United States. The number of persons who've been sentenced to death is also at an all-time low, and again, it's been decreasing consistently since the late 1990s. So, I mean, even though I think you're right that there are effects of polarization, and there are huge differences between the ways in which justice is meted out in the different regions of the country, and there's much more punitiveness and appetite for the death penalty in the Death Belt, which is the southern part of the United States. But still, the appetite has gone down across the United States. And we're at the lowest levels in terms of executions, in terms of death sentences, and the number of states that are abolishing the death penalty keeps on increasing. So we're now at approximately 20 states that have abolished. There are only 30 retentionist states, and again, it's been a continuous trend since the 1990s going up. Now, that reflects, I think that reflects a national sentiment about the death penalty, which is not, I would say, reflected in Trump's rhetoric, and it's not reflected in Trump's appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Bernard Harcourt, who teaches law at Columbia University, defends death row inmates. Many thanks for joining us here on France 24.